Welcome to Dreamy History. Here's what makes no sense about Japan. It is, by its very nature, an island nation, a volcanic archipelago flung out into the Pacific, historically isolated from the great continental powers of Asia. For centuries it cultivated a unique, almost hermetically sealed culture, producing art, philosophy, and social structures utterly distinct from its neighbours. Yet this same isolated nation would, in the blink of a historical eye, transform itself from a feudal society into a global industrial and military power, then rise from the ashes of unimaginable devastation to become a technological and cultural titan, influencing everything from animation to architecture across the globe. How does a land so deeply rooted in ancient traditions, where emperors claim descent from sun goddesses, so effortlessly reinvent itself? How does a people whose entire history is punctuated by the natural disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, forge such a profound sense of resilience and aesthetic beauty? It's a land of breathtaking contradiction, where delicate cherry blossoms fall on the shadow of Mount Fuji, a symbol of both serene beauty and terrifying geological power, much like its history. If you're enjoying this journey through history, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And I'm always curious. Drop a comment letting me know what city and time zone you're watching from. There's something special about knowing this story is reaching people all over the world. Let's start with the obvious question nobody asks. Where did Japan come from? Not the modern nation, but the very land itself. The traditional view, steeped in Shinto mythology, tells us of Izanagi and Izanami, divine siblings who stirred the primordial ocean with a jeweled spear, and from the drips that fell, the islands of Japan were formed, a divine creation for a divine lineage. It's a beautiful, resonant story. But here's the thing that blows my mind about Japan's earliest history. For Fizensen, upon thousands of years, people lived on those very islands in a stability almost unheard of in human history, before everything changed in a blink. The archaeological record tells a different, equally fascinating story of slow, human migration, adaptation, and an extraordinary period of cultural longevity that predates virtually all the myths. This deep history begins not with gods but with geology. Roughly 20,000 to 10,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, sea levels were significantly lower, and Japan was not quite the isolated archipelago we know today. Land bridges intermittently connected it to the Asian continent, particularly to the Korean peninsula and Siberia. It was across these now submerged land bridges, or perhaps by rudimentary boats navigating the narrow straits, that the first human inhabitants arrived. These were hunter-gatherers, following herds, seeking resources, much like people all over the world at that time. But as the glaciers retreated, the seas rose, and by around 10,000 BCE, Japan had become an island nation, isolating these early inhabitants and setting the stage for one of the most remarkable and enduring prehistoric cultures in human history, the Jomon. The name Jomon itself, coined in the late 19th century by American zoologist Edward S. Morse, means cord-marked, referring to the distinctive patterns pressed into their pottery. It's a simple name for a culture that thrived for an astonishing 10,000 years, from approximately 10,000 BCE to 300 BCE, making it one of the longest continuous cultural periods in human history. Imagine this early Japan, a landscape teeming with life. Dense deciduous and coniferous forests covered the mountainous interior, home to deer, wild boar and bears. The rivers and coastal waters were rich with salmon, shellfish and a dizzying array of marine life. These Jomon people were remarkably adept at exploiting this bounty. Unlike many other hunter-gatherer societies globally, the Jomon were largely sedentary, or at least semi-sedentary. They didn't need to roam constantly because their environment provided such a consistent and abundant food supply. They lived in pit dwellings, circular or oval depressions dug into the earth, with central hearths and conical roofs made of thatch or bark, often clustered into small villages. We've unearthed thousands of these sites, from Hokkaido in the north to Kyushu in the south, indicating a widespread and successful way of life. Their toolkits were sophisticated: finely crafted stone axes, knives and arrowheads for hunting, bone harpoons and fish hooks for fishing, and a variety of wooden implements for processing food. But what truly sets the Jomon apart, what makes them genuinely interesting, is their pottery. The Jomon people created the oldest known pottery in the world, dating back as far as 16,500 years ago in some regions. Think about that for a second. This wasn't just functional ware. It was often elaborate, featuring intricate patterns, sometimes even flame-like rims, giving rise to the famous flame pots from the Middle Jomon period. This pottery wasn't just for cooking or storage. It was an artistic expression, a testament to a culture that had the leisure and inclination to create beauty. They were making pottery thousands of years before agriculture became widespread, challenging the long-held assumption that pottery only arises with settled farming communities. This is where it gets genuinely interesting. The Jomon were hunter-gatherers who lived like farmers, building settled communities and developing complex crafts without ever cultivating crops on a large scale. Their diet was incredibly diverse. Nuts like chestnuts, walnuts and acorns, which required extensive processing to remove toxins, wild berries, a vast array of fish and shellfish, evidenced by enormous shell middens, ancient garbage heaps, found at their settlement sites, and game animals. They were master foragers and fishers, understanding their environment intimately. This extraordinary stability also manifests in their unique spiritual and artistic expressions. The Jomon produced thousands of clay figurines known as dogu. These stylized human or animal figures, with their often exaggerated features, large eyes, and sometimes alien-like appearance, are truly captivating. We don't know their exact purpose. Were they fertility symbols, ritual objects for healing or protection, representations of deities or ancestors? Historians argue about whether they were used in shamanistic practices, perhaps broken during rituals to transfer illness or misfortune from a person to the doll. What's clear is that they demonstrate a rich inner life and a sophisticated understanding of the human form, even if stylized. The sheer volume and variety of dogu suggest a deeply spiritual culture, attuned to the cycles of nature and perhaps seeking to influence them through ritual. They also buried their dead in specific ways, sometimes in shell middens, sometimes in flex positions, occasionally with grave goods, hinting at beliefs about an afterlife or continued connection to the community. The Jomon period represents a profound human success story, a culture that found a sustainable way to live in harmony with its environment for 10 millennia, largely egalitarian, with no evidence of monumental architecture, large-scale warfare, or significant social hierarchy. There were no kings, no grand temples, no vast empires. It was a world of small, self-sufficient communities, a testament to a different kind of progress. But this remarkable continuity was not destined to last forever. As the millennia passed, new ideas and new peoples began to stir on the Asian continent. Around 300 BCE, a dramatic shift began, often referred to as the Yayoi Revolution. This wasn't a slow evolution. It was a rapid, transformative influx of new technologies and a new way of life that would fundamentally reshape the Japanese archipelago, and we're only getting started. The arrival of these new people, bringing with them the knowledge of wet rice cultivation and advanced metallurgy, bronze and iron, would irrevocably alter the social, political and economic landscape of Japan. It would mark the end of the Jomon's long, stable era and usher in a period of rapid change, increasing population density, the emergence of social stratification, and eventually the first stirrings of a unified state. But that's a story for the next chapter, as we delve into the dynamic and often tumultuous Yayoi period. The Jomon, as we discovered, were a marvel, a people who mastered their environment, developed the world's oldest pottery, and lived in remarkable harmony for 10,000 years. Imagine that, a span of time so vast it swallows entire empires whole. But as we left them, the tide was turning. Around 300 BCE, the quiet, stable world of the Jomon was about to be rocked to its core by what historians often call the Yayoi Revolution. And revolution it was, in every sense of the word. Think about it. Japan, for millennia, had been a land of deep forests, abundant seafood, and ingenious hunter-gatherers. Now, suddenly new people arrive, bringing with them a trifecta of transformative technologies that would utterly reshape the archipelago. Where did they come from? Primarily from the Korean peninsula, driven by a mix of factors, perhaps climate change, perhaps political upheaval on the mainland, perhaps simply the allure of new lands. They weren't just a trickle, this was a significant migration, a wave of new ideas and new ways of life crashing onto Japan's shores. The most profound of these new ideas, the one that truly changed everything, was wet rice cultivation. Forget everything you thought you knew about how societies develop. The Jomon challenged the notion that pottery required agriculture. Now the Yayoi would demonstrate how agriculture, specifically wet rice farming, could completely rewrite the social contract. Imagine, if you will, the landscape shifting, where once dense forest dominated, now appear meticulously engineered paddy fields, carved into hillsides, fed by intricate irrigation channels. This wasn't just planting seeds, this was a monumental undertaking, demanding incredible organization, communal labor, and a deep understanding of water management. What did this mean for the people? For starters, population explosion. Wet rice farming is incredibly productive. A small plot of land can feed many more people than even the most abundant hunter-gatherer territory. More food means more people, and more people mean larger, more permanent settlements. The scattered pit dwellings of the Jomon, while cozy, gave way to larger villages, often built in strategic locations, sometimes even fortified. But here's where things get genuinely interesting, and where we start to see the first cracks in that idyllic Jomon egalitarianism. Wet rice agriculture isn't just productive, it's also labour-intensive and resource-dependent. You need land, you need water, and you need people to work it. Who controls the best land? Who manages the vital irrigation systems? Who organises the communal planting and harvesting? Suddenly those questions have answers that create power differentials. Someone, or some group, has to be in charge. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we begin to see the subtle, then not so subtle, emergence of social hierarchy. Alongside rice, the Yayoi migrants brought another revolutionary technology: metallurgy. For the Jomon, tools were stone, bone and wood. Now the Japanese archipelago entered the Bronze and Iron Ages simultaneously. Think about that for a second. While other civilizations often progress through these ages sequentially, Japan embraced both at once. Bronze, beautiful and lustrous, was primarily used for ceremonial and ritual objects. We see the emergence of magnificent kodotaku bronze bells, some standing over a metre tall, often elaborately decorated with scenes of deer, birds, and sometimes people. Their exact purpose remains a bit of a mystery, as is often the case with ancient artefacts. Were they musical instruments, status symbols, territorial markers? We can only speculate, but their sheer artistry and the effort required to produce them speak volumes about their importance. Alongside the bells, bronze mirrors, often imported or cast in the style of Chinese and Korean examples, became powerful symbols, perhaps used by shamans in rituals, reflecting not just light but spiritual power. Iron, on the other hand, was the workhorse. Harder and more durable than bronze, iron was forged into practical tools, hoes and spades for the paddy fields, axes for clearing land, and crucially weapons. And with better tools and more productive farming, coupled with a growing population and clearer social stratification, what inevitably follows? Conflict. The Jomon, for all their thousands of years, show remarkably little evidence of widespread warfare. Their settlements were open, their burials largely egalitarian. The yayoi, not so much. We start to see fortified villages surrounded by moats and palisades. Skeletal remains from this period sometimes bear the marks of violence, arrowheads embedded in bones, signs of blunt force trauma. This isn't just a few isolated skirmishes, this is evidence of organised conflict, likely over control of prime agricultural land, water resources, or emerging wealth. Small independent communities, which the Chinese would later call kunio countries or states, began to vie for dominance. So let's recap the transformation from largely egalitarian hunter-gatherers living in harmony with nature to settled agriculturalists. Organised into increasingly complex and hierarchical societies, armed with metal tools and weapons, and engaged in intermittent warfare. This is a seismic shift, a complete reordering of life on the archipelago, all happening in a relatively short span of centuries. But the Yayoi period isn't just about internal transformation. It's also the first time Japan truly steps onto the stage of world history, albeit through the lens of another powerful civilization. China. Imagine the scene. Small boats, laden with gifts, crossing the treacherous seas between Japan and the Korean peninsula, then continuing to the mighty Han court. These were the first recorded diplomatic missions from the Wei people, as the Chinese called them, to the Chinese Empire. These records, primarily the Book of Han, dating to the 1st century CE, and later the Weiji, records of Wei mid-3rd century CE, offer us the earliest written glimpses into what was happening in Japan, and what a fascinating picture they paint. The Chinese describe the Wa as a people living across the sea, divided into more than 100 countries. They noted their customs, they were fond of diving for fish, tattooed their bodies, and engaged in trade. They also mention their social structure, describing how leaders emerged and how some communities were ruled by women. This is a crucial point because it sets the stage for one of the most intriguing and enduring figures in early Japanese history, Queen Himiko. Queen Himiko. Her name, or rather her existence, is a rare beam of light piercing the mists of prehistoric Japan. The Weiji, specifically the account of the Wa people, tells us about her. Around the 3rd century CE, Himiko was a shamanist queen who ruled over a powerful state called Yamatai Koku. She was described as unmarried, having few male attendants and ruling through magic and spiritual power, communicating with the gods. Her younger brother assisted her in governing the state. Think about the implications here. A powerful female ruler combining both political and spiritual authority. This tells us a lot about the role of women in Yayoi society and the deep roots of shamanism and spiritual leadership in early Japan. Himiko's court regularly sent envoys to the Wei court in China, seeking recognition and legitimacy. In return, the Chinese emperor bestowed upon her the title Queen of Wa, friendly to Wei, along with gifts, including 100 bronze mirrors. Imagine the prestige those mirrors must have carried, not just as beautiful objects, but as tangible symbols of endorsement from the most powerful empire in the known world. The location of Yamatai-koku is one of the greatest archaeological debates in Japan. Was it in northern Kyushu, closer to the continent, making sense for early contact? Or was it in the Kinki region, near modern-day Kyoto and Nara, foreshadowing the later centres of Japanese power? Arguments for both sides are compelling, and the mystery only adds to Himiko's allure. But regardless of its exact location, Yamatai-koku was clearly a significant political entity, demonstrating the increasing consolidation of power that characterized the late Yayoi period. Himiko's story isn't just a fascinating anecdote, it's a critical piece of the puzzle. It shows us that by the 3rd century CE, Japan was no longer a collection of isolated, egalitarian villages. It was a land of emerging states with clear hierarchies, complex diplomatic relations, and powerful leaders who could command the loyalty of their people and negotiate with foreign empires. It's the first real glimpse of a proto-state, precursor to the unified Japan that would eventually emerge. The Yayoi period, therefore, is a testament to change. It's the story of how new technologies, rice and metal, acted as catalysts, transforming every aspect of life. It's the story of how abundance could lead to conflict, and how the need for organization could forge the beginnings of political power. From the quiet stability of the Jomon, we've moved into a dynamic, often tumultuous era of growth, consolidation, and the first whispers of a centralized authority. And this rapid trajectory of development, this relentless drive towards larger, more complex political structures, would not stop with Himiko. It was merely the opening act. As the Yayoi period drew to a close around 250 CE, the stage was set for an even grander display of power, an era defined by monumental construction and the true birth of a unified Japanese state. The foundations had been laid. Now it was time to build something truly awe-inspiring. We are talking, of course, about the age of the colossal burial mounds, the Kofun. The mystery of Yamatai-koku and the enigmatic Queen Himiko, you see, isn't just a fascinating historical puzzle. It's a profound foreshadowing. It's the rumble before the earthquake, the quiet before the storm of monumental change that was about to utterly redefine the Japanese archipelago. Because right on the heels of Himiko's reign, as the 3rd century CE gave way to the 4th, Japan entered a period that would lay the very bedrock for its imperial future, a time quite literally defined by mountains of earth and an unprecedented display of centralized power. Are you ready to dig into the dirt of ancient Japan? Because as we're about to dive headfirst into the Kofun period, a name that simply means old mound or ancient tomb. And let me tell you, these aren't just any old mounds. These are monumental, awe-inspiring, often baffling constructions that scream in silent earthen tones, someone very important lived here, and they wanted everyone to know it. Imagine this. You're walking through the nascent Japanese landscape around 300 CE. The Yayoi period's rice paddies now stretch further, the villages are larger, and the clang of iron tools is a constant hum. But then, on the horizon, you see it. Not a natural hill, but something unmistakably built. A massive, perfectly sculpted mound of earth, meticulously engineered, often surrounded by moats rising like a man-made mountain. This, my friends, is a kofun. And the people who built them? They were doing something truly revolutionary. What we're witnessing here is the consolidation of power on an epic scale. Those proto-states Himiko ruled over, they're still around, but one power center is rapidly asserting its dominance, the Yamato court. Originating in the fertile Kinai Plain, modern-day Nara Prefecture, the Yamato clan, or rather a confederation of powerful clans, began to expand its influence, first through military might, then through strategic alliances, and eventually through the sheer force of its cultural and political authority. They weren't just kings, they were becoming something more, something akin to emperors. And how do we know this? Because of those enormous burial mounds. Think about the logistics for a second. To construct a kofun, some of which are hundreds of meters long, requiring millions of cubic meters of earth to be moved by hand, you need an immense organized labor force. You need resources, planning, and a populace willing, or compelled, to dedicate their lives to building a monument for their ruler. This isn't just a grave, it's a declaration. It's a physical manifestation of an emerging social hierarchy, a testament to the power of a ruling elite, unlike anything Japan had ever seen. The most iconic of these kofun are the keyhole-shaped mounds, or Zenpoko and Fun. Yes, you heard me right, keyhole-shaped. Picture a giant circle connected to a trapezoidal front. Why this specific shape? Honestly, we don't definitively know. Their theories suggest it represents a symbolic lock and key, perhaps to the afterlife or a ritual space for ceremonies. But whatever its exact meaning, it's a unique and striking architectural form, almost exclusively found in Japan, and it screams unified culture and shared ideology at the highest levels of power. The largest of these, the Daisen Kofun, attributed to Emperor Nintoku, is absolutely mind-boggling. It's located in what is now Sakai, Osaka Prefecture, and it's one of the largest tombs in the entire world by area, larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It's estimated to have taken over 20 years and 2,000 workers daily to build. Just try to wrap your head around that. For a nation that was still in many ways developing its state apparatus, this was an astonishing feat of engineering and political will. Now, what did they put inside these colossal mounds? Well, that's where the story gets even more interesting. The tombs contained a wealth of artifacts, reflecting the status and beliefs of the deceased. We find elaborate bronze mirrors, often imported from China or meticulously crafted locally in their style, symbolizing authority and perhaps connecting the ruler to divine power. There are jade and magatama jewels, curved comma-shaped beads that date back to the Jomon period, but now signify imperial regalia, and of course iron swords and armour, a clear sign of military might and the increasingly martial nature of the ruling class. But surrounding these mounds, like silent sentinels, are perhaps the most charming and mysterious artifacts of the Kofun period, the haniwas. These are unglazed clay figures, often hollow, ranging from simple cylinders to elaborate depictions of people, animals, horses are common, houses and boats. They were placed on top of the kofun and around its edges, forming a protective or symbolic perimeter. And here's another one of those things that make no sense on the surface but reveals so much when you dig deeper. What exactly were the haniwa for? Were they guardians of the dead? Were they representations of the deceased's entourage, their possessions, or their spiritual journey? The variety is incredible. From warriors in armour to shamans, dancers and even chickens. They offer us a tantalizing glimpse into the daily life, technology, and spiritual world of the Kofun people, yet their precise ritualistic purpose remains a subject of ongoing debate. They are both incredibly informative and profoundly enigmatic. But the Kofun period wasn't just about building impressive tombs and filling them with treasures. This era was a crucible of cultural exchange, continuing the pattern we saw in the Yayoi period. The Korean peninsula remained a crucial conduit for continental influences. New waves of immigrants, often skilled artisans and scholars, arrived in Japan, bringing with them advanced technologies and ideas. One of the most significant imports during this time, again via Korea, was writing. Specifically, Chinese characters, or kanji. Imagine the impact of this. For millennia, Japanese society had relied on oral traditions. Now, suddenly, they had a way to record history, administer a growing state, and transmit complex ideas. While the full adoption and adaptation of kanji into a uniquely Japanese writing system would take centuries, its introduction in the Kofun period was a seismic shift, paving the way for written laws, literature, and official chronicles. Beyond writing, the Kofun period also saw the introduction of horse riding. The discovery of horse trappings and equestrian gear in Kofun tombs indicates that horses were not just used for transport but also for warfare. This would have fundamentally changed military tactics, creating a more mobile and powerful cavalry. New pottery styles like the high-fired ware, a grey hard pottery distinct from Yayoi ware, also arrived from the continent, showcasing further technological advancements. And then there's the question of religion. While Shinto, with its indigenous reverence for kami deities or spirits, was undoubtedly the prevailing spiritual framework, the groundwork for a truly revolutionary religious import was being laid. We're talking about Buddhism. Although its official introduction is traditionally dated to 538 CE, which marks the end of the Kofun period and the beginning of the Asuka period. The increasing contact with continental cultures meant that Buddhist ideas and artifacts were almost certainly trickling into Japan well before that official date. The Kofun rulers, with their growing sophistication and desire for legitimacy, would soon find in Buddhism a powerful new tool for statecraft and spiritual authority. So what does this all mean? The Kofun period isn't just a collection of big dirt mounds. It's the story of how Japan, after millennia of diverse regional developments, began to coalesce into a unified state. It's the story of the Yamato court, asserting its dominance, laying the foundation for what would eventually become the Japanese imperial line, a lineage that remarkably continues to this day. It's a period where we see the transition from tribal confederations to a more centralized, hierarchical society, fueled by continental innovation and expressed through monumental architecture. This era is a testament to the incredible ambition and organizational prowess of early Japanese rulers. They were building an empire, one giant keyhole mound at a time, solidifying their power, importing crucial technologies, and setting the stage for the dramatic cultural explosion that was about to follow. The peace of the Jomon was long gone. The regional squabbles of the Yayoi were being subsumed. A powerful, unified Japan was beginning to emerge, ready to absorb, adapt, and transform everything it encountered into something uniquely its own. And trust me, the journey only gets more fascinating from here. The Kofun period, with its monumental tombs and imported technologies, laid the groundwork. We saw the Yamato court begin its ascent, centralizing power and looking outwards for inspiration, even as it solidified an internal structure. But if you thought the Kofun era was a period of intense transformation, hold on to your hats, because what came next was nothing short of a cultural earthquake, a seismic shift that would fundamentally redefine Japan. Imagine for a moment, if you will, a society that has, for millennia, drawn its spiritual nourishment from the land itself, from the mountains, the rivers, the trees, the very kami that inhabit the natural world. This is Shinto, a beautiful indigenous faith deeply intertwined with the rhythms of life on these islands. Then picture a new religion arriving on its shores, not just as a set of beliefs, but as an entire civilization in a box. That, my friends, is precisely what happened with the introduction of Buddhism. It wasn't just a different way to pray, it was a completely different way to think. Buddhism arrived in Japan around the mid-6th century CE, primarily via the Korean kingdom of Baekje, which was eager to forge closer ties with the rising power of the Yamato court. Now this wasn't some quiet, gentle arrival. Oh no, this was a political bombshell, a clash of worldviews that plunged the Yamato elite into decades of intense, sometimes violent internal conflict. On one side, you had clans like the Mononobe and the Nakatomi, staunch defenders of the native kami and the traditional Shinto order. They saw Buddhism as an alien threat, something that would offend the ancestral deities and bring ruin upon the land. And frankly, you can understand their apprehension. This new religion came with elaborate rituals, complex philosophical texts, and a cosmology that seemed to dwarf the more localized, immediate concerns of Shinto. On the other side, you had powerful, ambitious clans like the Soga. They were the progressives, the innovators, the ones who saw the immense potential in embracing this new cultural package. They understood that Buddhism wasn't just a religion, it was a conduit for advanced continental knowledge, writing systems, sophisticated art and architecture, medical practices, and, crucially, a highly organized system of statecraft that had allowed the great empires of China to flourish. For the Soga, Buddhism was modernity, a tool to consolidate and legitimize the Yamato court's power, to elevate Japan to a new level on the world stage. This wasn't just a theological debate, it was a power struggle for the very soul of the nascent Japanese state. The historical accounts describe actual battles, the burning of temples, the casting of Buddhist statues into canals. It was messy, it was brutal, and it was absolutely pivotal. Ultimately, the Soga clan triumphed, and with their victory, Buddhism was officially embraced, opening the floodgates for an unprecedented influx of continental culture. This wasn't a slow trickle, it was a deluge. Suddenly, Japan was awash in new ideas, new aesthetics, new ways of organizing society. Think about it. For millennia, Japan had been relatively isolated, developing its own unique culture. Then, in a relatively short span, it began to absorb and adapt elements from one of the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth. This isn't just interesting, it's a testament to Japan's incredible adaptability and its genius for taking foreign influences and making them uniquely its own. And at the heart of this transformative era, standing like a colossus, was a figure whose vision would shape the course of Japanese history for centuries. Prince Shotoku Taishi, 574–622 CE. If you're looking for an individual who truly kicked Japan into high gear, who laid the intellectual and spiritual foundations for a unified nation, Shotoku is your man. Shotoku, a regent for Empress Suiko, was a fervent Buddhist and a brilliant statesman. He understood that for Japan to truly become a powerful centralized state, it needed more than just a strong military. It needed a coherent ideology, a sophisticated administrative structure, and a clear sense of its place in the world. And he looked directly to China, specifically Tang China, for his blueprint. His most famous accomplishment, perhaps, is the 17-article constitution, promulgated in 604 CE. Now, don't imagine a modern constitution with articles about individual rights and governmental checks and balances. This was something far more profound for its time. A set of moral and ethical injunctions, a guide for officials and the populace alike, designed to foster harmony and establish a new moral order rooted in Buddhist and Confucian principles. Article 1, for example, famously declares, "Harmony is to be valued, and an avoidance of wanton opposition is to be honoured." Think about that. In a world often defined by tribal rivalries and power struggles, Shotoku was advocating for consensus, for collective well-being, for a state built on ethical governance. He emphasized reverence for Buddhism, obedience to the emperor, and the importance of meritocracy in government appointments. This wasn't just a wish list, it was a philosophical framework for a truly centralized, ideologically coherent state. But Shotoku's vision extended beyond internal reform. He also dramatically reoriented Japan's foreign policy. For centuries, Japan had largely interacted with China through the Korean peninsula, often in a subordinate role. Shotoku decided to go direct. He dispatched formal embassies to the Sui court in China, a bold move that signaled Japan's growing self-confidence. And here's where it gets genuinely mind-blowing. In one famous letter to Emperor Yang of Sui, Shotoku began, "The Son of Heaven in the land of the rising sun addresses a letter to the Son of Heaven in the land of the setting sun." Whoa! Pause for a second. This was revolutionary. For a smaller, peripheral kingdom to address the mighty Chinese emperor as an equal, to assert its own imperial legitimacy, was an act of audacious defiance. It was a declaration that Japan was not merely a tributary state, but a sovereign nation with its own divine ruler. This is the moment, many argue, where the name Nihon, Japan, meaning origin of the sun, truly began to take root, solidifying as a national identity that would endure. These embassies weren't just about diplomatic posturing, they were about learning. Japanese scholars, monks and artists travelled to China, immersing themselves in its culture, its legal systems, its philosophies, its technologies. They brought back a treasure trove of knowledge that fueled an artistic and intellectual explosion known as the Asuka period, named after the region where the Yamato court was located. This era saw the construction of magnificent Buddhist temples, like the iconic Horyuji, commissioned by Shotoku himself, which still stands today as one of the world's oldest wooden structures. Its architecture, its sculptures, its paintings all reflect a powerful blend of continental styles adapted and imbued with a nascent Japanese aesthetic. The momentum generated by Shotoku continued after his death, culminating in the Taika reform of 645 CE. This was another monumental leap towards centralization, a comprehensive overhaul of the state administration, again heavily modelled on the Tang dynasty's Ritsuryo system, a legal and administrative code. Imagine this, the Yamato court, now firmly in control, declared that all land in Japan belonged to the emperor. That's right, all of it. While private land ownership wasn't entirely abolished, the reform aimed to redistribute land to peasants in exchange for taxes in the form of rice, labour or local products. This wasn't just about revenue, it was about establishing direct control over the populace and their resources, bypassing local strongmen and consolidating power at the centre. They also established a sophisticated hierarchical bureaucracy, a complex system of ministries and departments designed to govern every aspect of national life, from finance to justice to military affairs. New capital cities like Fujiwara-kyo were planned and built on a grand grid-like scale, mirroring the Chinese imperial capitals, symbolizing the new order. These weren't just random settlements, they were meticulously designed expressions of imperial power and administrative ambition. The Taika reform, coupled with the continued absorption of the Ritsuryo codes, effectively transformed Japan from a collection of powerful clans loosely united under the Yamato court into a fully fledged, centralized imperial state. It provided the legal, administrative, and ethical scaffolding upon which future generations would build. And as part of this drive for national identity and legitimacy, the court commissioned the creation of official histories. These were the Kojiki, records of ancient matters, 712 CE, and the Pal Nihon Shoki, Chronicles of Japan, 720 CE. These texts weren't just historical records. They were powerful narratives designed to legitimize the imperial line, tracing the emperor's lineage directly back to the sun goddess Amaterasu. They blended myth and history, creating a grand, unified story of Japan's origins, from the divine creation of the islands by Izanagi and Izanami, through the Age of the Gods to the establishment of the imperial dynasty. It was a masterstroke of nation-building, giving the nascent state a deep sacred past and a clear, divinely ordained future. So what do we have by the end of this period? We have a Japan that has consciously, strategically, and often violently embraced foreign ideas. We have a Japan that has transformed itself from a series of tribal confederations into a centralized, bureaucratic, and ideologically unified state. We have a Japan that has asserted its equality with China, developed a sophisticated written language, using Chinese characters, of course, built magnificent temples, and created its own foundational myths. This was a period of breathtaking speed in cultural development, a testament to the Yamato court's ambition and the Japanese people's incredible capacity for adaptation. They didn't just copy, they internalized, they adapted, they innovated. They took the raw materials of continental civilization and began to forge something uniquely Japanese. This was the crucible, the moment when the foundations for the classical Japanese state were truly laid, setting the stage for an era of even greater artistic, literary, and political splendor. We are, my friends, just getting started. The ink on the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki was barely dry, their myths of divine imperial lineage still echoing through the nascent state, when Japan made a truly monumental decision. For centuries the capital had been a movable feast, shifting with each emperor's death to avoid the spiritual pollution of mortality. But no more. The Taika reforms, the influx of Tang sophistication, the sheer ambition of a burgeoning empire, all demanded permanence. They demanded a beating heart, a grand statement of power and prestige. And so, my friends, around 710 CE, we arrive at the Nara period and the construction of Heian-kyo. Imagine this, a vast grid, meticulously planned, stretching across the flat plain of Yamato. This wasn't just a city, it was a mirror reflecting the magnificent capital of Chang'an in Tang China, the greatest metropolis of its age. Streets wider than anything Japan had ever seen, laid out in a perfect chessboard pattern, leading to the grand imperial palace at the northern end. Here, in Heian-kyo, the Ritsuryo system, those imported laws and administrative codes truly took root. This was where the centralized bureaucracy, with its ministries and its carefully ranked officials, would govern the provinces, collect taxes, and administer justice across the land. It was a bold, audacious declaration. Japan was not merely imitating China, it was emulating it, adapting its best ideas, and forging its own path as a powerful unified nation. But what truly defined Nara, what truly gave it its soul and its monumental physical form, was something we've already touched upon: Buddhism. Remember how Prince Shotoku championed it? How the Soga clan fought for it? By the Nara period, Buddhism wasn't just tolerated or even favoured, it was the official state religion, deeply intertwined with imperial authority. The emperors, particularly Emperor Chomu, saw Buddhism not just as a path to enlightenment, but as a protector of the realm, a spiritual shield for the nation. And Emperor Shomu, bless his devout heart, wasn't one to do things by halves. He embarked on a building project so colossal, so ambitious, it still takes your breath away today. He commanded the construction of Todaiji, the Great Eastern Temple, and within it the Daibutsu, the Great Buddha. Think about that for a second. We're talking about a bronze statue of the cosmic Buddha Vairakana, standing over 50 feet tall, weighing hundreds of tons. This wasn't just an artistic endeavour, it was an act of national will, a feat of engineering and resource management that beggars belief for the 8th century. It required an immense amount of copper, gold and labour, practically bankrupting the state. People from all walks of life, from aristocrats to peasants, were conscripted or encouraged to contribute, driven by a shared spiritual fervour and imperial decree. When the Daibutsu was finally dedicated in 752 CE, it was an event of staggering pomp and ceremony, attended by thousands, including emissaries from as far away as India and Persia. It was Japan's coming-out party on the global stage, a testament to its cultural sophistication and its deep spiritual commitment. Todaiji, with its Daibutsu, became the head temple of a nationwide network of provincial temples known as the Kokubunji system. Each province was to have its own temple and nunnery, all under the spiritual and administrative authority of Todaiji. This wasn't just about spreading Buddhism, it was about strengthening central control, unifying the country under a single spiritual banner, and ensuring the prosperity and protection of the state through Buddhist merit. It was a fascinating blend of faith and governance, where the spiritual well-being of the nation was seen as directly linked to the health of the emperor and the stability of the realm. This integration of Buddhism, Shinto and the imperial line, often called the Sango, the Three Guardians, is one of those quintessentially Japanese things that make no sense until they make perfect sense. How could a foreign religion like Buddhism coexist and even merge with indigenous Shinto beliefs? Because as Japan so often shows us, it's not about choosing one or the other. It's about synthesis, about finding harmony in apparent contradiction. Buddhist kami deities were seen as manifestations of Shinto kami and vice versa. It was a spiritual syncretism that allowed both traditions to flourish, each enriching the other, all under the benevolent gaze of the imperial family. But even with such grand spiritual and political endeavours, human nature, particularly the lust for power, has a way of complicating things. The very success of state-sponsored Buddhism in Nara began to pose a problem. The immense wealth, land and influence accumulated by the great monasteries and their powerful abbots started to challenge the imperial court itself. Monks became politically active, wielding significant power and even meddling in succession disputes. Perhaps the most infamous example is the monk Dokkyo. A charismatic and ambitious figure, he gained immense influence over Empress Koken, who later reascended the throne as Empress Shotoku. His power grew to such an extent that he was even rumoured to harbour ambitions of becoming emperor himself, a concept utterly unthinkable for a non-imperial commoner, let alone a monk. The court was thrown into turmoil and eventually, after the empress's death, Dokkyo was exiled, This episode served as a stark warning. The spiritual power of Buddhism, if unnecked, could become a political threat. Beyond the grand temples and political intrigues, the Nara period was also a time of profound cultural flourishing. This was the era of the Manyoshu, the collection of 10,000 Leaves, Japan's first great anthology of poetry. It's a truly remarkable work, containing over 4,000 poems composed by everyone from emperors and empresses to court ladies, frontier guards and anonymous commoners. The Manyoshu is a window into the souls of early Japan. It's filled with poems of love, lament, longing, the beauty of nature, the changing seasons, the sorrows of separation, and the joys of sake. Unlike later, more refined court poetry, it has a raw, immediate emotional power. You can feel the wind on the poet's face, the ache in their heart, the profound connection they felt to the mountains and the sea. It shows us a Japan already deeply attuned to aesthetic beauty, a sensitivity that would become a hallmark of its culture. And then there's the shosoin. Oh, the shosoin. Imagine a wooden storehouse built in the style of a raised-floor granary. Within the compound of Todaiji, it was originally built to house the personal treasures of Emperor Shomu after his death, donated to the Great Buddha by Empress Komyo. But it became so much more. This incredible repository preserved almost perfectly thousands of artifacts from the 8th century, including furniture, musical instruments, masks, textiles, and even medicines. What makes the shosoin truly mind-blowing, however, is not just the sheer volume or the pristine condition of its contents, but their origin. Yes, there are magnificent Japanese pieces, but there are also items from Tang China, Korea, Persia, India, and even as far as the Middle East brought to Japan via the Silk Road. We're talking about glass bowls, metalwork and dyes that testify to Japan's vibrant connections to a vast interconnected Asian and even global network. It utterly shatters any preconceived notions of an isolated, insular Japan, even in this relatively early period. It shows us a Japan actively engaging with the world, absorbing and adapting influences with an insatiable curiosity. Yet, despite all this cultural splendor and centralized ambition, the Ritsuryo system, for all its Tang-inspired elegance, was beginning to show cracks. The land distribution system, designed to ensure equal access to rice paddies and tax revenue for the state, was proving difficult to maintain. Powerful aristocratic families and Buddhist monasteries began to accumulate vast tax-exempt private estates known as shuen. This was a direct challenge to the central government's authority and its tax base, slowly but surely eroding its power and shifting wealth into private hands. The burden of taxation and conscription also weighed heavily on the peasantry, leading to unrest and a gradual breakdown of the neat ordered vision of the Ritsuryo state. Combine these growing administrative difficulties with the increasing political influence of the Buddhist clergy, and you start to understand why the imperial court might feel a growing unease in Nara. The city, once a symbol of imperial power and spiritual protection, was becoming a hotbed of political intrigue and religious meddling. So, in the late 8th century, another emperor, Kamu, made another momentous decision. He resolved to move the capital yet again. This wasn't about avoiding pollution from death this time, but about escaping the entrenched power of the Buddhist establishment and rejuvenating the imperial government. He first tried Nagaoka-kyo, but after a series of calamities and political assassinations that were interpreted as bad omens, he abandoned it. Finally, in 794 CE, Emperor Kamu settled on a new location, a valley surrounded by protective mountains, fed by clear rivers. He named it Heian-kyo, the capital of peace and tranquility. And with that, we close the book on the Nara period and open a new magnificent chapter in Japanese history, one that would last for over 1,000 years and define much of what we now understand as classical Japan. The court, the culture, the aesthetics, the very soul of Japan were about to embark on an unparalleled journey of refinement and introspection, leaving the grand, outward-looking ambitions of Nara behind for a new era of exquisite beauty and subtle power games. So Emperor Kammu, bless his pragmatic heart, had enough of the Nara headaches. The sprawling temples, the politically ambitious monks, the ever-growing shogun, those tax-exempt private estates, remember, all chipping away at imperial authority like termites on a wooden beam. He needed a fresh start, a clean slate, a capital where the imperial family could reassert its divine right without a colossal Buddha breathing down its neck. And so, in 794 CE, after a rather disastrous attempt at Nagaoka-kyo, the capital moved again. This time it was for the long haul. Welcome, my friends, to Heian-kyo, the capital of peace and tranquility, or, as we know it today, Kyoto. Imagine, if you will, the bustling construction. This wasn't just a relocation, it was a grand statement. Heian-kyo was meticulously planned, a stunning grid laid out on a basin, flanked by mountains to the north, east and west, with a river to the south. It was a mirror image of Tang China's Chang'an, but with a distinctly Japanese aesthetic already beginning to bloom. At its heart sat the imperial palace, a sprawling complex of elegant wooden buildings surrounded by gardens and ponds, designed not for defense but for beauty and ceremony. The very name, peace and tranquility, whispered a hope, a fervent desire that this time things would be different. No more meddling monks, no more power struggles, just a serene centralized imperial rule. Ah, if only history were that simple, right? Because almost immediately a new force began to quietly, elegantly and utterly dominate the political landscape, the Fujiwara clan. Now, the Fujiwara weren't some upstart warlords. They were an ancient aristocratic family, deeply embedded in the court from the time of the Taika reform. But in the Heian period, they perfected a strategy so brilliant, so subtle, that it allowed them to rule Japan for centuries without ever actually sitting on the throne themselves. How did they do it? Through marriage. Yes, you heard me right. Marriage. Think about it. The emperor was divine, a living god. But even a god needs an empress. The Fujiwara ensured that almost every emperor married a Fujiwara daughter. And when a Fujiwara daughter became empress, her sons became emperors. And guess who became the regent, Sessho, for a child emperor, or the chief advisor, Kampaku, for an adult one, a Fujiwara father, uncle or brother. It was an ingenious system, a bloodline lock on power. The emperor might wear the crown and perform the sacred rituals, but the real levers of power, appointments, land grants, foreign policy, were firmly in Fujiwara hands. It's one of those beautiful, baffling Japanese contradictions, isn't it? A divine emperor, revered above all, yet a powerful aristocratic family, pulling the strings behind the silken screens. This was the era of courtly elegance, of exquisite aesthetics, of a cultural flourishing unlike anything Japan had seen before, or arguably since. With the Fujiwara comfortably in control, the imperial court and its surrounding aristocracy had the luxury to turn inward, focusing on refinement, beauty, and the pursuit of miyabi. That elusive concept of courtly elegance, sensibility, and aesthetic taste. Life within the palace walls and aristocratic estates was a delicate dance of poetry, music, calligraphy, fashion, and romance. Imagine this: a moonlit garden, the scent of plum blossoms, a courtier composing a waker poem on a fan, his silks rustling softly, ladies in waiting hidden behind layers of colourful kimonos and carefully arranged hair, exchanging witty verses and scandalous gossip. This was a world of subtle gestures of implied meanings, where a perfectly chosen poem or a brushstroke in a letter could convey more than 1,000 spoken words. It was a world obsessed with beauty, with the fleeting nature of things, with a profound appreciation for no-aware, the poignant beauty of impermanence, that bittersweet awareness of the transience of life. And this refined world gave us some of the greatest literary masterpieces in world history. We're talking about the novel, folks, centuries before Europe really got going. Take Murasaki Shikibu's The Tale of Genji, written in the early 11th century. This isn't just a story, it's a sprawling, multi-generational epic, a psychological masterpiece exploring the loves, losses, and political machinations of the shining prince Genji and his descendants. It's a window into the Heian court, rich with detail about customs, fashion, and the intricate emotional lives of its characters. And then there's Sei Shonagon's The Pillow Book, a collection of witty observations, lists, anecdotes, and critiques of court life. Imagine reading a blog from 1,000 years ago, filled with sharp insights and unapologetic opinions. That's The Pillow Book. What's truly fascinating is that these groundbreaking works were written by women. Why women? Because while men were busy studying Chinese classics and writing in classical Chinese, the official language of government and scholarship, women were using a new, uniquely Japanese writing system, kana. Until this point, Japanese was written using Chinese characters, kanji, for their sound or meaning, a cumbersome and often confusing system. But during Heian, phonetic silbaris, hiragana and katakana, collectively kana, were developed, simplifying the written language. Hiragana, with its flowing cursive strokes, was initially called onna-de, women's hand, because it was primarily used by women. This allowed them to express themselves with unprecedented freedom and nuance in their native tongue, creating a vibrant literary culture separate from the formal male-dominated world of Chinese scholarship. It's a testament to the power of language and the incredible ingenuity of Japanese women that they pioneered a new form of expression, and in doing so, shaped the future of Japanese literature. But here's where the peace and tranquility of Heian-kyo starts to unravel, and another great Japanese contradiction emerges. While the court was composing poetry and admiring cherry blossom, the provinces, the vast majority of Japan, were increasingly neglected. The central government, absorbed in its aesthetic pursuits and internal power struggles, slowly lost its grip on the distant lands. The Ritsuryo system, that Grand Tang-inspired bureaucracy, was crumbling. Tax revenues dried up as more and more land became shuen, exempt from imperial taxation and effectively run by powerful local families or religious institutions. And who was going to protect these estates? Who was going to enforce order when the central government couldn't or wouldn't send troops? That's right. People started taking matters into their own hands. Local strongmen, often descendants of minor aristocratic lines who had been sent to the provinces, or powerful landowners, began to arm themselves and their retainers. They trained in archery, horsemanship, and swordsmanship. They developed a code of loyalty and discipline. They were the bushi, the warrior class, and we know them better by another name, the samurai. For centuries, the court had disdained military matters, viewing them as crude and beneath the refined sensibilities of Heian aristocracy. The very word samurai originally meant one who serves, referring to those who served the nobility. But as the court retreated further into its aesthetic bubble, these servants were becoming increasingly powerful, self-sufficient, and crucially armed. They were the muscle, the enforcers, and the protectors of the realm, albeit a realm fractured into countless private holdings. Imagine the stark contrast. In Heian-kyo, courtiers debated the precise shade of purple for a lady's sleeve, while out in the countryside, men honed their skills with bow and blade, settling disputes with steel and blood. This growing disconnect, this widening chasm between the elegant capital and the rugged provinces, was a ticking time bomb. Even within the court, cracks began to show in the Fujiwara's seemingly unassailable power. Some emperors, fed up with being mere figureheads, tried to reassert their authority. The most notable strategy was the insei system, or cloistered rule. An emperor would abdicate, often at a relatively young age, retire to a Buddhist monastery, hence cloistered, and then rule from behind the scenes, free from the ceremonial burdens of the throne, and crucially free from direct Fujiwara influence. It was another one of those incredible Japanese innovations, a way to circumvent a seemingly unbreakable power structure without resorting to outright rebellion. The imperial family wasn't just resilient, it was incredibly adaptable, always finding a new way to survive and exert influence. So by the late Heian period, the political landscape was a tangled mess. A divine emperor on the throne, a cloistered emperor potentially pulling strings from a monastery, the Fujiwara clan still clinging to their regency, and out in the provinces, two massive, ambitious warrior clans, the Minamoto, also known as Genji, and the Taira, also known as Heike, growing in strength and influence, often serving both the court and the cloistered emperors, but with their own agendas simmering beneath the surface. These warrior clans, initially employed by the court to suppress rebellions or protect powerful figures, began to understand their own collective power. They were the only ones who truly knew how to fight, how to command armies. The refined courtiers of Heian-kyo, for all their poetic brilliance, were utterly dependent on them. The Heian period, therefore, is a fascinating paradox, a golden age of culture, art and literature, especially for women where an unparalleled aesthetic sensibility flourished, but simultaneously an era of political decay where central authority eroded and the seeds of a new, military-dominated age were sown. The stage was set, the players assembled, and the tension was palpable. The elegant world of the Tale of Genji was about to collide head-on with the brutal reality of the sword. And that, my friends, is where our story takes its most dramatic turn. The Heian period, for all its exquisite poetry and refined sensibilities, was a magnificent glittering facade. Beneath the polished lacquer of courtly elegance, the foundations of imperial power were crumbling, eroded by the very shown system that had enriched the aristocracy. The emperor, once an absolute divine figure, was now a revered but largely powerless symbol, skillfully manipulated by the Fujiwara regents. But even the Fujiwara couldn't hold back the tide forever. Remember those provincial warrior clans we talked about, the Bushi? The ones who carved out order in the chaotic countryside, protecting the shuen that the court couldn't govern? Well, they weren't just content to be glorified bodyguards anymore. They had grown strong, organized, and utterly essential. And by the late Heian, two clans stood head and shoulders above the rest. The Taira, also known as the Heike, and the Minamoto, or Genji. Now, this is where things get genuinely interesting, because what followed was a conflict that would utterly redefine Japan. Imagine, if you will, the most sophisticated, aesthetically obsessed court in the world, suddenly plunged into a brutal continent-spanning civil war. It's like a haiku competition suddenly turning into a cage match. The Taira, initially, were the darlings of the court. Led by the charismatic Taira no Kiyomori, they had risen through the ranks, even into marrying with the imperial family, just like the Fujiwara before them. For a while, it seemed they might simply replace the Fujiwara as the power behind the throne, bringing their warrior might into the elegant confines of Kyoto. But here's the paradox. Their very success in the capital began to soften them, to dilute their warrior ethos. They became too comfortable, too arrogant, too entrenched in court politics, making enemies along the way. Enter the Minamoto. They had been sidelined, even purged by the Taira in earlier conflicts. But they were not broken. Instead, they simmered in the provinces, honing their martial skills, cultivating loyalty among other warrior families, and nursing a deep burning resentment. This wasn't just a political squabble, it was a clash of cultures, a reckoning between the refined aristocratic warrior and the rugged provincial land-based fighter. The stage was set for the Genpei War, 1180 to 1185. A 5-year epic that would echo through Japanese history and literature. If you've ever heard of the legend of the samurai, much of its romanticized image comes from this period. It was a conflict of dramatic land battles, daring naval engagements, and incredible personal feats of bravery. On the Minamoto side, we have figures who have become legends. Minamoto no Yoritomo, the cunning strategist and political mastermind who would ultimately establish a new order, and his younger half-brother, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, a military genius whose battlefield prowess was almost mythical. He was a whirlwind of tactical brilliance and audacious courage, often winning battles against overwhelming odds. The Taira, on the other hand, for all their initial strength, found themselves increasingly isolated, their arrogance alienating potential allies. The war culminated in the epic naval battle of Wadan no Ura in 1185. Picture this. Hundreds of ships clashing in the churning waters of the Kanmon Strait, arrows raining down, samurai grappling in hand-to-hand combat, the cries of battle echoing across the waves. It was a decisive Minamoto victory, but one tinged with profound tragedy. The Taira, facing utter defeat, chose mass suicide over capture. And in one of the most poignant moments in Japanese history, the young Emperor Antoku, a mere child of 7, was drowned by his grandmother, who clutched him tightly as they plunged into the sea, rather than let him fall into enemy hands. The imperial regalia, the sacred sword, mirror, and jewel, went with them. Though the mirror and jewel were later recovered, the sword was lost forever, adding a layer of mystique to the tragedy. The Genpei War marked the definitive end of the Heian era and the beginning of something entirely new. Warrior rule. Minamoto no Yoritomo, now the undisputed leader, made a radical decision. Instead of establishing his government in Kyoto, where he might be corrupted by courtly intrigues, he set up his headquarters in Kamakura, a coastal town far to the east, strategically isolated and easily defensible. This was the birth of the Kamakura shogunate, 1185-1192, the first bakufu, or tent government. Think about that for a second. The emperor remained in Kyoto, still revered as a divine descendant of Amaterasu, still performing the rituals, but the real political and military power now resided with the shogun in Kamakura. This dual system, a titular imperial court and an actual warrior government, would define Japan's political landscape for the next 7 centuries. It's a breathtaking contradiction, isn't it? a nation ruled by two separate, often competing centers of power. Yoritomo, a shrewd administrator, centralized warrior authority. He appointed shugo constables to oversee provinces and jito stewards to manage estates, effectively extending Kamakura's reach across the entire archipelago. He established a system based on loyalty, martial prowess, and pragmatic governance. The samurai, once just provincial strongmen, were now the ruling class, their code of honor and discipline beginning to solidify into something recognizable as Bushido. But even Yoritomo's carefully constructed order wasn't immune to the power struggles that seemed to plague Japanese history. After his death, the Hojo clan, Yoritomo's in-laws, skillfully maneuvered themselves into power. They became regents for the shoguns, effectively controlling the bakufu while appointing puppet shoguns, often children, from the Minamoto or even the imperial family. It was the Fujiwara trick all over again, but this time the power behind the throne was a warrior family, not a courtier one. The Hojo regency proved remarkably stable and effective for many decades, maintaining the warrior government's authority. Then the unthinkable happened. From across the sea, a threat emerged that would test Japan's resilience like never before. In the late 13th century, the mighty Mongol Empire, having already conquered China and much of Asia, turned its gaze towards Japan. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, demanded Japan's submission. The Hojo regency, fiercely proud and unwilling to bow, refused. In Kohu 74, the first Mongol invasion fleet arrived. It was enormous, perhaps 900 ships carrying 40,000 Mongol, Chinese and Korean warriors. Imagine the terror. Japan had never faced anything like it. The samurai, though individually brave and skilled, were used to one-on-one combat, not the massed formations, gunpowder weapons, and brutal efficiency of the Mongols. The invaders landed in Hakata Bay in Kyushu, and the fighting was fierce. The samurai put up a valiant defense, but they were outmatched. Then fate intervened, or as the Japanese believed, the gods themselves. A massive typhoon and utterly ferocious storm swept across the Sea of Japan, utterly devastating the Mongol fleet. Ships were smashed against the shore, thousands of soldiers drowned. The invasion was repelled, not by samurai kahaki swords, but by the furious hand of nature. The Japanese called this divine wind the kamikaze hang. Kublai Khan was not deterred. 7 years later, in Hoodhul 81, he launched an even larger invasion. This time the fleet was staggering, an estimated 400 ships and 40,000 men, perhaps the largest naval invasion force in history, until D-Day. Japan had prepared. They had built a massive stone wall along Hakata Bay, a formidable defense. For weeks, the samurai held the line, fighting desperately against the relentless waves of invaders. Again, the heavens roared. Another colossal typhoon, even more powerful than the first, descended upon the Mongol fleet. It was an apocalyptic storm, shattering ships, scattering forces, and drowning tens of thousands. The second invasion, too, was utterly annihilated. The Mongol invasions were a pivotal moment. They instilled in the Japanese a profound sense of their own divine protection, a belief that their land was special, guarded by the gods. It solidified a sense of national identity against a common existential threat. But paradoxically, these victories ultimately weakened the Kamakura shogunate. The defensive wars had been incredibly costly, and unlike offensive campaigns, there was no new land or plunder to distribute as rewards to the victorious samurai. Many warriors were left unrewarded, deeply in debt, and increasingly disaffected. This discontent, combined with the Hojo's growing arrogance and a series of natural disasters, created cracks in the Bakufu's power. The time was ripe for another audacious attempt to shift the balance of power. Enter Emperor Go-Daigo. This emperor was no mere figurehead. He was a brilliant, ambitious, and utterly determined man who believed fiercely in the divine right of the imperial house. He saw the Kamakura shogunate as an illegitimate usurper of imperial authority and dreamed of restoring direct imperial rule. This was the Meiji Restoration, 1303-1336. Go-Daigo, in a series of daring moves, managed to rally support, including from some powerful warrior families dissatisfied with the Hojo. One of these was Ashikaga Takauji, a general from a prominent Minamoto branch family. Takauji, initially sent by the Hojo to crush Go-Daigo, instead switched sides, turning his forces against Kamakura. The Hojo regency was overthrown, and the Kamakura shogunate collapsed. For a brief, shining moment it seemed Go-Daigo had achieved the impossible. Imperial rule was restored. But here's the thing about history. It rarely goes exactly as planned. Go-Daigo, for all his vision, fundamentally misunderstood the warrior class. He favoured courtiers, neglected samurai grievances, and tried to resurrect the old Heian aristocratic system. The warriors, who had fought and bled for him, felt alienated and unrewarded, and so the very general who had helped him, Ashikaga Takauji, turned against him. Takauji, recognizing that the warrior class would not accept a return to purely aristocratic rule, marched on Kyoto. Go-Daigo was forced to flee, taking the imperial regalia with him, and established a rival court in the mountains to the south. Takauji, in turn, installed a new emperor in Kyoto, establishing what became known as the Pong Northern Court. Go-Daigo's court became the Southern Court. This began the tumultuous Nanboku-cho, Northern and Southern Courts period 1336 to 1392. A brutal and confusing era of civil war that lasted for over 50 years. Japan now had two emperors, each claiming legitimacy, each backed by different warrior factions. It was a time of immense upheaval, where loyalties were constantly shifting and the landscape was scarred by endless conflict. Ashikaga Takauji meanwhile established the Ashikaga shogunate, 1336 to 1573. Also known as the Hamuramachi shogunate, in Kyoto. This was a significant departure from Kamakura. By placing his bakufu within the capital, Takauji effectively brought warrior rule back into the sphere of imperial influence, albeit still as the dominant power. The Ashikaga shoguns, however, never commanded the same centralized authority as their Kamakura predecessors. They ruled more as first among equals, relying heavily on the support of powerful regional lords, or daimyo. Eventually in 1392, the southern court was finally brought to an end and the imperial line was reunited under the northern court, cementing the Ashikaga's position. But the seeds of decentralization sown during the Nanboku-cho Wars and inherent in the Ashikaga's reliance on regional daimyo had taken root. So what have we seen in this whirlwind of a chapter? We've witnessed the definitive shift from courtier rule to warrior dominance, a transition cemented by the bloody Genpei War. We've seen the establishment of the Bakufu system, a unique dual government that would shape Japan for centuries. We've marvelled at Japan's miraculous resilience against the mightiest empire on earth, the divine winds of the kamikaze, becoming a cornerstone of national myth. And we've seen the internal strife, the ambition of emperors and generals alike tear the country apart, leading to a new shogunate with a more fragmented, less absolute grip on power. The stage is now set for an era of even greater decentralization, where regional lords will grow incredibly powerful and Japan will plunge into a period of near-constant warfare. But that, my friends, is a story for the next chapter. The Ashikaga shogunate, as we just discussed, managed to bring an end to the Nanbokucho period, unifying the imperial line and establishing its bakufu in Kyoto. But here's the kicker, the truly mind-bending paradox. Moving the capital to the very heart of imperial culture, to Kyoto, didn't centralize their power. In fact, it did the opposite. It weakened them. Think about that for a second. The Kamakura shogunate, far away from the imperial court, could maintain a distinct warrior identity and enforce its will. But the Ashikaga, nestled amongst the refined courtiers, the poets, the artists of Kyoto, became too refined. They got caught up in the aesthetics, the politics of the capital, losing their grip on the distant provinces. They relied on the powerful regional lords, the daimyo, to maintain order. But those daimyo were increasingly seeing themselves as kings in their own right. Imagine a spiderweb, intricate and beautiful, but with the spider at the center slowly losing its ability to feel the vibrations at the edges. That was the Ashikaga shogunate. Their authority was a suggestion, not a command. They were patrons of the arts, yes, the elegant Kinkakuji, Golden Pavilion, and Ginkakuji, Silver Pavilion, are enduring testaments to their refined taste, but politically they were becoming a shadow. And then it all fell apart, catastrophically. We're talking about the Onin War, a decade-long conflagration that ignited in 1467 and burned until 1407. This wasn't just another skirmish. This was the ultimate expression of the Ashikaga's unravelling. It started, as so many devastating conflicts do, with a succession dispute within the shogunate itself. Two rival factions, each backing a different claimant to the shogunal title, drag the most powerful daimyo clans into their squabble. The Yamana and Hosokawa clans, two colossal powers, became the primary antagonists, but underneath it all, every daimyo saw an opportunity to expand their territories, to settle old scores, to simply survive in a world where the center could no longer hold. Picture this. Kyoto, the ancient capital, the jewel of Japanese culture, home to emperors and poets and exquisite gardens, became a battlefield. For 10 years the city was ripped apart. Armies numbering in the tens of thousands clashed in its streets, burning temples, mansions, and entire districts to the ground. The refined aristocrats, who had once dictated fashion and poetry, fled to the provinces, seeking refuge with the very daimyo, whose power they once disdained. The bakufu itself ceased to function. Its authority, already tenuous, vanished in the smoke and ash of its own capital. It's genuinely hard to overstate the impact of the Onin War. It wasn't just a war. It was an earthquake that shattered the very foundations of the medieval order. When the fighting finally sputtered out, exhausted rather than won, Japan was no longer a country under a central government. It was a mosaic of hundreds of independent, constantly warring states. Welcome, my friends, to the Sengoku period, the warring states period. From 1467 to 1603, Japan plunged into a century and a half of relentless, brutal civil war. This era is often characterized by a concept called Gekkokujo, literally, the low overthrowing the high. Imagine a world turned upside down. Vassals betrayed their lords, retainers seized power from their masters, even peasants, organized into militant groups called ikki, rose up against the daimyo. Merit, ruthlessness, and sheer ambition suddenly mattered more than birthright or ancient lineage. If you were clever, strong, and utterly without scruples, you could carve out an empire from nothing. The landscape of Japan during the Sengoku period was a patchwork of warring domains, each controlled by a daimyo who was constantly fighting to expand their territory, defend their borders, or simply survive. These daimyo were not just military leaders, they were administrators, tax collectors, judges, and city planners. They built formidable castles, not just simple fortifications, but massive multi-storied structures called tenshu, keep, symbols of their power and centers of their domains. These castles were strategically placed on mountains or plains, dominating the surrounding landscape, their intricate defenses a testament to the constant threat of invasion. Warfare itself transformed. Gone were the days of elegant, ritualized cavalry duels between individual samurai. The Sengoku period saw the rise of massive armies, often numbering in the tens of thousands, composed not just of samurai but also of ashigaru, peasant foot soldiers armed with spears, swords, and eventually firearms. These were disciplined, organized forces capable of complex maneuvers and sustained campaigns. The scale of destruction was immense, but so was the innovation. New tactics, new siege techniques, and new forms of military organization emerged from the crucible of constant conflict. And speaking of innovation, one of the most significant arrivals during this period was, ironically, from outside Japan. In 1543, a Chinese junk carrying Portuguese traders and missionaries was shipwrecked off the coast of Tanegashima Island. And what did these Europeans bring with them? The Boer arquebus. A primitive but devastatingly effective firearm. Think about the impact of that. For centuries, Japanese warfare had relied on bows, swords, and spears. Suddenly, a weapon appears that can kill a samurai in heavy armor from a distance, with relatively little training. It was a game changer. Daimyo immediately recognized its potential and scrambled to acquire and mass-produce these fire sticks. Within a few decades, Japanese gunsmiths were manufacturing high-quality arquebuses, and commanders like Oda Nobunaga would revolutionize warfare by integrating massed arquebusiers into their armies, unleashing volleys that could break any charge. The Portuguese also brought something else: Christianity. Jesuit missionaries, led by the charismatic Francis Xavier, arrived in 1549. Initially, many daimyo welcomed them, not necessarily for their faith, but for the trade opportunities they represented, especially the lucrative silk and silver trade with China via Portuguese Macau. Conversions, particularly in Kyushu, soared. Churches were built and Western ideas, art and technology began to trickle into Japan. It's another one of those incredible juxtapositions, a nation tearing itself apart internally yet simultaneously opening itself up to radical foreign influences. Amidst all this chaos and destruction, however, a vibrant culture continued to flourish, albeit with a different flavour. The refined courtly aesthetics of Heian-kyo gave way to a more austere, yet equally profound sensibility influenced by Zen Buddhism. The samurai, facing constant life or death situations, found solace and discipline in Zen's emphasis on meditation, self-control, and the acceptance of impermanence. This influence permeated everything from martial arts to art forms like sumi-e, ink painting, and the exquisite Shastis tea ceremony. Chanuyu. The tea ceremony, perfected during this period by masters like Sen no Rikyu, was far more than just drinking tea. It was a ritualized act of aesthetic appreciation, a quiet moment of harmony. respect, purity, and tranquility in a world of violence. It embodied the concept of wabi-sabi, finding beauty in imperfection, transience, and simplicity. Imagine these fierce daimyo, fresh from the battlefield, retreating to a small minimalist tea hut, leaving their swords outside and engaging in this profoundly peaceful ritual. It's another one of those truly Japanese contradictions that makes you marvel. Economically, the Sengoku period was also a time of significant change. While the old shogun system had largely collapsed, new economic centres emerged. Merchant classes gained power, and castle towns grew into bustling cities, facilitating trade and craft production. The constant demand for weapons, supplies, and luxury goods fueled an internal economy that, despite the warfare, was dynamic and innovative. So for over a century, Japan was a land of 1,000 battles, a fragmented archipelago where loyalty was fleeting and power was seized by the strongest. It was a period of immense suffering, but also of incredible resilience, innovation, and a fierce, unyielding spirit. It's easy to get lost in the sheer number of warring factions, the shifting alliances, the endless succession of battles. But what we need to remember is that this chaos, this gekkokujo, couldn't last forever. Japan, a nation that consistently seeks harmony and order, would eventually find a way to reassert itself. And it did, through the rise of three extraordinary figures, often referred to as the three great unifiers of Japan. Each had a distinct personality, a unique approach, and a pivotal role in bringing the long, bloody Sengoku period to an end. First, there was Oda Nobunaga, the ruthless innovator, a visionary military genius who embraced firearms and shattered old traditions. He famously said, "If the cuckoo does not sing, I will kill it." He was the first to truly envision a unified Japan, and he set about achieving it with brutal efficiency. Then came Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Nobunaga's humble sandal-bearer, who rose from peasant origins to become the ultimate success story of Gekkokujo. He was a brilliant strategist, a master of diplomacy, and a charismatic leader who could charm and intimidate in equal measure. His philosophy for the cuckoo: "If the cuckoo does not sing, I will make it sing." And finally, Tokugawa Ieyasu, the patient, calculating survivor. He was a master of endurance, waiting for his moment, learning from the mistakes of others, and ultimately establishing a peace that would last for over 2 centuries. His take on the cuckoo: "If the cuckoo does not sing, I will wait for it to sing." These three titans would, in succession, begin the arduous process of stitching Japan back together, piece by bloody piece, forging a new order from the ashes of the Sengoku chaos. Their stories are not just tales of war and conquest. They are testaments to ambition, genius, and the enduring Japanese drive for unity, even when it seems utterly out of reach. We're about to witness the dramatic culmination of the warring states, a period that tested the very soul of Japan and ultimately reshaped its destiny. Get ready, because the stage is set for an epic, transformative journey. And so, we stand at the precipice of a new era, a Japan utterly shattered by the Onin War and the ensuing century and a half of relentless conflict. The Sengoku period, the warring states, was a crucible, forging a new kind of Japan, but at what cost? Imagine the landscape: once proud Kyoto in ruins, regional daimyo constantly vying for power, castles rising and falling, and the air thick with the smell of gunpowder, a new and terrifying import. Gekkokujo, the low overthrowing the high, was not just a philosophy. it was the daily reality. But from this chaos, a pattern emerges, a narrative thread woven by three truly extraordinary individuals. These are the three great unifiers of Japan: Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. You might know their famous adage, a little parable about a cuckoo bird that won't sing. Nobunaga says, "If the cuckoo does not sing, kill it." Hideyoshi says, "If the cuckoo does not sing, make it sing." And Ieyasu says, "If the cuckoo does not sing, wait for it to sing." This, my friends, encapsulates their wildly different personalities and approaches to the monumental task of bringing Japan under a single, unified rule. Let's start with the first, the most audacious, the most brutal, Oda Nobunaga, 1534–1582. He burst onto the scene in Owari Province, modern Aichi Prefecture, like a force of nature. Nobunaga was, to put it mildly, unconventional. He was known for his eccentric dress, his disdain for tradition, and his terrifying ambition. He was nicknamed the Demon King, Dairakuten Mao, not just for his ruthlessness, but for his willingness to shatter old norms. Think about this for a second. A warrior lord who openly embraced Western firearms, strategically deploying them in disciplined ranks to decimate traditional samurai cavalry charges. His victory at the Battle of Okehazama in 1560, where he famously defeated a much larger force, solidified his reputation. He was a master of innovation, of tactics, of seizing the moment. Nobunaga saw the path to unification clearly: eliminate the old powers, embrace the new. He understood that the power of the daimyo lay in their castles and their armies, but also that the powerful Buddhist monasteries, with their own warrior monks and vast landholdings, represented a significant political and military threat. And so, in one of the most shocking acts of the Sengoku period, he systematically dismantled their power. In 1571, he laid siege to Mount Hiei, home to the Enryakuji temple complex, a sprawling centre of Tendai Buddhism with a formidable army of warrior monks. He burned it to the ground, slaughtering thousands. It was a brutal, horrifying act, but it sent an unequivocal message. No one, not even the most sacred institutions, would stand in his way. He crushed rivals, expanded his territory, and even welcomed Christian missionaries, not out of deep faith perhaps, but as a counterweight to the Buddhist establishment and for the valuable trade they brought. He was a pragmatic, visionary, and utterly terrifying leader, steadily consolidating power across central Japan. By 1582, Nobunaga was on the verge of achieving his lifelong ambition. He controlled vast swaths of the country, and his generals were pressing his advantage in all directions. But history, as we know, loves a twist. While campaigning, Nobunaga was forced to take refuge at Honnoji Temple in Kyoto. There, he was betrayed by one of his most trusted generals, Akechi Mitsuhide. Surrounded with no hope of escape, Nobunaga committed seppuku, ritual suicide. It was a sudden, shocking end to a man who seemed unstoppable. The cuckoo, in this case, was indeed killed. Into this sudden void stepped the second unifier, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, 1537–1598. Now, Hideyoshi's story is genuinely mind-blowing. Unlike Nobunaga, who came from a respectable samurai family, Hideyoshi started as a peasant, a sandal-bearer for Nobunaga himself. Imagine that, from carrying his lord's shoes to effectively ruling Japan. It's an incredible testament to his sheer talent, charisma, and cunning. When news of Nobunaga's death reached him, Hideyoshi acted with astonishing speed. He made a hasty truce with his current adversary, raced back to Kyoto, and within days avenged Nobunaga by defeating Akechi Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki. This swift, decisive action immediately positioned him as Nobunaga's natural successor. Hideyoshi, the monkey, as Nobunaga affectionately, or perhaps mockingly called him, was a master politician and strategist, though perhaps lacking Nobunaga's sheer ruthlessness. He continued the work of unification, not through brute force alone, but through a combination of brilliant military campaigns, shrewd diplomacy, and innovative administrative reforms. He completed the conquest of Shikoku and Kyushu, and by 5090, after the siege of Odawara, he had brought all of Japan under his control. The Sengoku period, after 150 years, was finally over. But Hideyoshi wasn't just a conqueror, he was a builder and a reformer. He initiated extensive land surveys, kenchi, across the country, accurately assessing agricultural output and ensuring tax revenue for the central government. He confiscated weapons from the peasantry in what became known as the hunt, katana-gari, effectively disarming the common people and solidifying the samurai's monopoly on warfare. This also served to create a clear separation between the samurai and the peasant classes, freezing social mobility and laying the groundwork for the rigid class structure of the Edo period. He built magnificent castles, most notably the colossal Osaka Castle, a symbol of his immense power and the new centralized authority. He even created a lavish or golden tea room for the tea ceremony, a stunning display of his wealth and his embrace of high culture. He was a man of grand gestures, of immense ambition, who truly made the cuckoo sing. However, Hideyoshi's ambition ultimately overreached. With Japan unified, his gaze turned outward. He launched two massive, disastrous invasions of Korea in 1592 and 1597, intending to conquer China via the Korean peninsula. These campaigns, though initially successful, bogged down into brutal stalemates, draining Japan's resources and lives, and ultimately failing. They were a catastrophic miscalculation, leaving a legacy of resentment in Korea and weakening his own position at home. Hideyoshi died in 1598, leaving behind a young son, Hideyori, and a council of 5 regents, including the third and final unifier, Tokugawa Ieyasu. Hideyoshi, ever the pragmatist, had tried to secure his son's succession, but the seeds of discord had already been sown. The cuckoo had sung, but its song was cut short, and the stage was set for the final act of unification. Enter Tokugawa Ieyasu. 1543 to 1616. If Nobunaga was the demon and Hideyoshi the monkey, Ieyasu was the patient fox. He was born into a minor daimyo family, caught between powerful neighbours, including the Oda and Imagawa clans, and his early life was marked by hardship and political hostage-taking. He learned the arts of survival, diplomacy, and patience better than anyone. He was a vassal of Nobunaga, then a powerful ally of Hideyoshi, always biding his time, consolidating his own domain, and building his strength. He was a master of the long game, waiting for the cuckoo to sing on its own terms. When Hideyoshi died, the carefully constructed balance of power shattered. The Council of Regents quickly fractured, and 2 major factions emerged. One loyal to Hideyori and led by Ishida Mitsunari, and the other, far more powerful, led by Ieyasu himself. This wasn't just a succession dispute, it was a struggle for the ultimate control of Japan. The nation, having just emerged from a century and a half of civil war, was once again on the brink. The climax arrived in the autumn of 1600. The two great armies representing the east and west factions converged on a narrow valley in what is now Gifu Prefecture. This was the Battle of Sekigahara, fought on October 21, 1600. Imagine the scale. Over 160,000 warriors, samurai from across the entire archipelago, facing off in a dense fog that slowly lifted to reveal the opposing forces. It was a battle of epic proportions, a clash of titans that would determine the fate of Japan for the next 250 years. Ieyasu, ever the strategist, had meticulously planned for this moment. He had cultivated alliances, spread rumours, and secured promises of defection from key daimyo on the opposing side. The battle itself was a chaotic, bloody affair, with initial skirmishes giving way to a full-scale melee. For hours the outcome hung in the balance, but then the tide turned dramatically. Several crucial daimyo, most notably Kobayakawa Hideaki, who had been sitting on the fence, suddenly switched sides, attacking Ashida Mitsunari's flank. This act of betrayal shattered the Western Army's morale and formation. The dominoes fell quickly. By the end of the day, Ieyasu's Eastern Army had achieved a decisive victory. Sekigahara wasn't just a battle, it was the ultimate unification of Japan. It cemented Tokugawa Ieyasu's position as the undisputed ruler of the entire country. He meticulously hunted down and eliminated remaining opposition, including Hideyori's forces at the siege of Osaka Castle years later, 1614 to 1615, ensuring no future challenges to his family's rule. In 1603, Ieyasu was formally appointed Eio shogun by the emperor, establishing the Tokugawa shogunate in his new capital of Edo, modern Tokyo. This marked the beginning of a truly unprecedented era in Japanese history, the Edo period, 1603 to 1868, a period of over 250 years of relative peace, stability and isolation. The long bloody saga of the Sengoku period was finally over. The cuckoo, after being killed, made to sing and patiently waited for, was now singing in perfect harmony. But what kind of harmony would it be, and at what cost would this peace be maintained? The answer, as always with Japan, is complex, contradictory, and utterly fascinating. So here we are. After centuries of bloodshed, betrayal, and the relentless, brutal churn of the Sengoku period, Japan finally found its peace. A peace forged in fire and secured by the patient, iron will of Tokugawa Ieyasu. In 1603, with the establishment of his shogunate in Edo, the curtain rose on an era unlike any other in Japanese history, the Edo period. Imagine that for a second. Over 250 years of relative stability. Think about the sheer scale of that achievement. A quarter of a millennium where the primary concern wasn't which daimyo would launch a surprise attack tomorrow, or whether your village would be razed by a passing army. This was an unprecedented stretch of calm, a deliberate act of national engineering designed to prevent the chaos of the past from ever returning. But here's the genuinely interesting question, the one that makes you lean in. How did they do it? How did the Tokugawa shogunate manage to lock down an entire nation, keep the peace and maintain control over hundreds of powerful, often rebellious daimyo for so long? It wasn't just about winning a battle, it was about building a system, an intricate web of control and ideology that would endure for generations. And, as we'll see, it came at a profound cost, shaping Japan in ways that would reverberate for centuries to come. The Tokugawa approach was multifaceted, brilliant in its pragmatism, and in many ways utterly ruthless. Their strategy revolved around three main pillars: controlling the daimyo hokoke, enforcing a rigid social hierarchy, and isolating Japan from the outside world. Let's start with the daimyo. These were the regional lords, the warlords who had carved up Japan during the Sengoku period. Ieyasu knew they were the biggest threat to his new peace. He couldn't simply eliminate them all. There were too many, and their influence was too deeply rooted. So he devised a system that was both genius and excruciating: Sankin Kotai, or alternate attendance. Here's how it worked. Every daimyo was required to maintain a residence in Edo, the shogun's capital, and not just any residence, a grand, impressive one, suitable for a powerful lord. But here's the kicker: they had to spend every other year living in Edo. When they returned to their domain, their wife and eldest son had to remain in Edo as hostages. Think about that for a second. Your family, your heir held by the shogun. That's a powerful incentive to stay loyal, wouldn't you say? The journey itself was an incredible spectacle. Every daimyo had to travel to and from Edo in a massive procession, complete with samurai retainers, servants, and all the pomp and circumstance befitting their status. This wasn't just a commute, it was a demonstration of wealth and power, both of the daimyo and, by extension, the shogun who commanded such loyalty. But here's the brilliant hidden cost. These processions were astronomically expensive. Maintaining two households, financing these annual migrations, it drained the daimyo's coffers, preventing them from accumulating the wealth needed to raise armies and challenge the shogun. It was a financial straitjacket, cleverly disguised as a mandatory display of prestige. The effects of Sankin Kotai were profound, reaching far beyond just keeping the daimyo in check. It spurred the development of a nationwide network of roads and post stations facilitating travel and communication, an infrastructure boon. It also led to the massive growth of Edo itself, transforming it from a fishing village into one of the largest cities in the world, a vibrant hub where regional cultures converged. Imagine all these daimyo and their retinues bringing their regional goods, customs and ideas to the capital. It was a melting pot, inadvertently fostering a new sense of national identity, even as it enforced central control. Beyond Sankin Kotai, the shogunate employed other methods. Castles were destroyed or strictly limited in number and size. Marriages between daimyo families required shogunal approval. Spies and informants were everywhere. The message was clear: the Tokugawa was in charge, and any deviation would be met with swift and decisive force. The second pillar was the enforcement of a rigid hereditary social hierarchy, heavily influenced by Neo-Confucianism. The Tokugawa adopted this philosophy as the official ideology, emphasizing loyalty, filial piety, and a strict social order. The system was famously divided into four main classes: Shi no Kosho. At the very top, of course, were the samurai. Shi, they were the ruling class, the warriors who had won the peace, but with peace came a new challenge. What do you do with a warrior class when there are no wars to fight? Many samurai transitioned into bureaucrats, administrators and scholars, exchanging their swords for brush and ledger. Their status was high, their honor paramount, but their economic reality often quite different. They were paid stipends, usually in rice, and as the economy shifted towards a money-based system, many samurai found themselves in increasing debt. This is a crucial paradox. The highest class, the foundation of Tokugawa rule, often found itself struggling financially, leading to quiet resentment and a growing sense of irrelevance. Next came the farmers. No, they were the backbone of the economy, producing the rice that fueled the nation. Despite their vital role, they were heavily taxed and lived a hard life. The shogunate understood that a stable agricultural base was essential for stability, but this didn't translate into an easy existence for the cultivators themselves. Below them were the artisans, the skilled craftspeople who made everything from pottery and textiles to swords and tools. They were respected for their skills, but generally held a lower social standing than farmers. And finally, at the bottom of the official hierarchy were the merchants. This is where things get really interesting, and where the Tokugawa system started to show its cracks. In the Neo-Confucian view, merchants were seen as unproductive, simply moving goods around and profiting from the labour of others. They were the lowest of the low, lacking honour or direct contribution to society. Yet as Japan entered this long period of peace, commerce flourished. Cities grew, trade routes expanded, and a money economy took root. And who benefited most from this? The merchants, of course. They accumulated vast wealth, built impressive businesses, and lived lives of luxury that often shamed the impoverished samurai above them. This created a profound tension, a class with immense economic power but no social status, and a class with supreme social status but often little economic power. This contradiction would be a slow-burning fuse throughout the Edo period, fueling new cultural forms and eventually challenging the very foundations of the shogunate. The third and perhaps most defining pillar of Tokugawa peace was sakoku, the policy of national isolation. This wasn't an immediate decision, but a gradual tightening of borders driven primarily by a deep suspicion of foreign influence, particularly Christianity. Remember Francis Xavier and the Portuguese bringing Christianity in the Sengoku period? Nobunaga had tolerated it, even used it against the Buddhist monasteries. Hideyoshi had grown wary and eventually banned it. Ieyasu and his successors saw Christianity as a direct threat to their authority and the stability of the nation. Its emphasis on a single god above all earthly rulers was anathema to the deeply ingrained loyalty owed to the shogun and emperor. So over several decades in the early 17th century, Japan systematically closed itself off. All foreign priests were expelled. Japanese converts were persecuted, often brutally, leading to events like the Shimabara Rebellion of 1637-38. A peasant uprising with Christian undertones that was ruthlessly suppressed. Japanese citizens were forbidden from leaving the country, and those who had gone abroad were forbidden from returning. Foreign ships, with a few crucial exceptions, were turned away. The construction of ocean-going vessels was banned. Japan became by design an island unto itself. The exceptions are fascinating and tell us a lot about the pragmatic nature of the Tokugawa. Limited trade was allowed with China and Korea, and most famously a small Dutch trading post was permitted on the artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki harbour. The Dutch, being Protestants, were seen as less interested in proselytizing and more interested in commerce. They were subjected to incredibly strict controls, allowed only minimal interaction with Japanese citizens, and served as Japan's narrow window to the outside world, a trickle of information, a few scientific texts, and a constant wary eye on global developments. Sakoku was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it achieved its primary goal. It eliminated foreign interference, stamped out Christianity, and allowed the Tokugawa to consolidate internal power without external distractions. It fostered a unique, inward-looking development of Japanese culture, art, and philosophy. It was a period of incredible internal refinement, giving rise to iconic art forms like ukiyo-e, woodblock prints depicting the floating world of urban pleasure districts, sophisticated theatre like kabuki and bunraku. and the elegant simplicity of haiku, poetry, perfected by masters like Matsuo Basho. On the other hand, it meant Japan missed out on the scientific, technological, and industrial revolutions sweeping through the West. For over 2 centuries, while Europe and America modernized at a breakneck pace, Japan remained largely static technologically, preserving its feudal system. It created a sleeping giant, unaware of the immense power disparities that were building up beyond its self-imposed borders. The divine winds that had saved Japan from the Mongols were now self-generated, a deliberate barrier against the world. So the Edo period was a time of contradictions, a period of profound peace yet built on a foundation of strict controls, financial burdens, and social rigidity. Samurai, once fierce warriors, became civil servants, often struggling to make ends meet, while merchants, officially at the bottom, amassed fortunes. A vibrant urban culture flourished, giving birth to new art forms and entertainment, even as the government tried to enforce conservative Neo-Confucian values. The Tokugawa shogunate achieved its primary objective: stability. For 250 years, Japan enjoyed an era of unprecedented peace and internal development. But this peace was not without its cost. The very mechanisms designed to maintain order also sowed the seeds of future discontent. The rigid class system, the financial strain on the samurai, the rising power of the merchant class, and the growing intellectual curiosity about the outside world, despite Shoku, these were the subtle pressures building beneath the surface of Tokugawa Japan. The land of breathtaking contradiction had once again created a unique solution to its problems. But this solution, like all things, contained the seeds of its own eventual transformation. The calm, as we will soon discover, could not last forever. The world, after all, was still out there, and it was about to come knocking, very loudly indeed.